Welcome to the program, everyone. Today we have the great honor and privilege to speak with Dr. Tim Coles, eminent scholar, scientist, passionate conservationist, and recipient of the OBE. We're speaking with him today from the United Kingdom. Dr. Coles, thank you for joining us on our show today.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much. Now, Dr. Coles, you received an OBE, Order of the British Empire, for your contribution to scientific studies. Most Koreans here are not familiar with that award. Can you tell us about the award and how it's conferred?
It's a bit of a secret on how they're conferred. There's a committee that meets that advises the Queen on people that they think are worthy of being given an OBE for their contribution to different parts of society. And mine was awarded for conservation and environmental work.
I see. Now, it seems that conservation is your life's passion. What motivated you to champion conservation efforts?
Well, it's basically because growing up I always had an interest in wildlife, and I wanted to get a job that allowed me to be outside and to work with wildlife. And so I went to university to study zoology, and then I did a PhD in fisheries. And then my first job was as a fisheries scientist in a rural part of England. And the job was to be able to quantify the fish populations in rivers and lakes around that area. And as I got into that job and continued with it, it seemed to me that the one thing that was really missing from wildlife conservation was any sort of proper scientific approach to it, in not just creating lists of species, but quantifying communities and population sizes, and doing that year after year after year, so that you could then see whether things were changing. And if they were changing for the worse, you could then do an intervention. And unlike in most aspects of sort of wildlife conservation, you could actually monitor it. You didn't just do it because everybody said you'd do that. You did it, and then you monitored and you checked, and you could see whether it was working or not working. And essentially, I spent 13 years doing that, and eventually also came into sort of wildlife conservation as well as fisheries, and used the same approach as well. Quantify what's there, monitor it, do an intervention to see if it's working, and then measure that.
Ah, that's fascinating. Now, Tim, you're working with Oxford University on initiatives that enable companies to invest in carbon credits from the restoration of tropical forests. Can you tell our viewers how this is good for both business and the environment?
Right, well, the biggest single problem, in my view, that's facing mankind is deforestation, because it has a double whammy. It's the number one driver of loss of biodiversity. So there were some scientists that published a paper a few years back, and what they did is they looked at the 8,500 most threatened species in the world, and they worked out, what's pushing them over the edge, what got them in that situation. And the number one reason, 77% of the cases, was overexploitation. That's either deforestation or overhunting or overfishing. And then it was things like urban expansion, agricultural development, pollution, invasive species. Actually, last on the list was climate change. Relatively minor compared to the loss of those forests. But when you look at the climate problems that we're having, the solution to the climate problems is exactly the same as the solution to the biodiversity problem. It's reforesting. And if we reforested that area, we would take up 2/3 of the carbon dioxide that had been emitted from the Industrial Revolution. More forest equals taking out more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so the reason that it's good for business is because business needs long-term sustainability. That's a crucial element to it. And so many businesses these days are now looking to their sort of carbon footprint, not just of what they're doing, but what their suppliers are doing. And they're aiming to be carbon zero by 2050 or whatever. I mean, for example, I was recently talking to Mars and to Microsoft, and they're looking to be carbon negative in the relatively near future. In other words, they actually take up more carbon than they are emitting throughout the whole of their operations.
Tim, I have a question. How can you get transparency in a scheme like this?
I think that's absolutely crucial in this type of scheme, and it's basically done in two ways. One is we have a good relationship with the Oxford University Long-Term Ecology Lab, And the idea is to have a website for every hectare of forest that's being reforested with pictures on it. Taken every 3 months, calculations of how much carbon's in it, ownership of it, who owns that land and who's benefiting from having those trees, so that the client or the customer of any company that's funding this sort of work can go in and look immediately exactly how that funding is being spent and see that that carbon really exists. And secondly, they get carbon credits.
I see. Now, Tim, can you tell us about the corona situation in the UK? Do you think that the UK government did an adequate job fighting the virus? And do you think Brexit at all played any role?
Firstly, I always feel very sorry for politicians. And I must be one of the very few people in the world who feel sorry for politicians. But in a situation like this, it's almost impossible. Whatever you do, you're going to get criticised for it. And I always feel as though we shouldn't sit on the sidelines and throw too many brickbats at politicians for this sort of thing. I see we're top of the league table now for excess deaths in Europe. So clearly things haven't gone well over here. But it's a difficult situation. I think it's almost impossible to know how to respond to it, whether you use the Swedish approach or whether you use the lockdown approach. The point about the lockdown approach is that when you look at excess deaths, they're not all caused by COVID. Some of them are caused by basically closing the hospital system and not allowing cancer patients in, and or people with heart conditions that could have been cured. So it's a very tricky situation. In terms of Brexit, no, I don't think that had any significant impact on it. It's not helping, but it certainly had no significant impact, in my view, on the way we tackle coronavirus.
Can you share your views on how the virus will affect both the scientific community and the global economy?
Well, the global economy is having a disastrous effect on, as you've probably seen, because you can't close entire sectors of the economy for 3 or 4 months and expect to have the same GDP at the end of the year. The part of the economy that never gets mentioned is not the Western economy, because we have the luxury of being able to close down and suffer a 10% loss and still be able to eat and survive. It's places like developing countries. They don't have that luxury. They can't close down. And the impact on those communities of then losing what trade they had internationally has been horrendous. That's my greatest concern, and yet you never seem to see this discussed anywhere. It's the impact on us here in Britain or somewhere in Germany. Yeah, we'll survive it. Yeah. But if you're in a developing country and you've lost all your trade, will you survive it? That's much more serious.
Right, absolutely. Now, it seems that the coronavirus emerged from human interaction with the natural world, and it's likely other viruses will appear in this way. What is the impact on the environment, and how can humanity more effectively manage this risk?
Well, there's an author I read a lot of, who's called Matt Ridley, who predicted exactly this happening a few years ago in a short book called Pandemic, and he predicted that the next pandemic would come either from bats or from pigs, and was likely to be something like a coronavirus. I mean, the first thing we can do is stop eating wildlife. That would be a huge benefit, not just to the biodiversity and stop importing species from all over the world, but stop eating them, which will reduce the chances of the next pandemic happening. We will not avoid it. There will be future pandemics, but it will be a way of reducing it, is to reduce the amount of wildlife eaten.
I see. Do you think that human civilization can be transformed into a wiser, ecological civilization as a result of the pandemic?
But I do think that we will make some advances. I think this is almost like a war. And you always notice during a war, if you look at the history, you'll see that people after a major event like that want to build back differently. They want to do something differently. And I think the movement at the moment is climate change, is to try and reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that's going into the atmosphere. I hope they can link that to reforestation and protecting of biodiversity, but I think there is a new awareness that we cannot live on this small planet and keep doing what we're doing. We're going to have to make some changes. And I hope that is one of the good things that comes out of the pandemic.
Now, finally, are there any stocks or sectors that you would like to share with our viewers today?
I'm not an expert in this, so for goodness sake, don't take my advice. But I would really suggest things like, green energy, anything that looks as though it's helping the environment, I think is going to do particularly well over the next few decades. As soon as we come out of the pandemic, of course. And of course, drug companies, they're probably the ones to back right at the minute.
Dr. Tim Coles, thank you very much for taking time to talk with us today on Global Science.
All right. Thank you very much.
Dr. Tim Coles, eminent scholar and scientist, recommends that investors look at the clean energy sector once the pandemic ends. I want to thank everyone again for joining us today on Global Science. We look forward to seeing everyone again very soon. Thank you very much.